Some of this will be review for those of you who are in class today on the 20th, and we'll move forward from there as well. So if you have these two ideas, and God said, and then later on God said, and there was a gap in the middle, what do we expect there to be? What do we expect there to be? We expect there to be some kind of conversation, another side of the conversation, which requires the writer to say, and God said again. But here, so the problem here is what then? Right? So the problem here is that it says, and God said, but there's no change in speaker. So why does it need to say, and God said again? And we have Robert Alter brings up a really interesting point here. He says, this is the first instance in the Torah of a common convention of biblical narrative. When a speaker addresses someone, and the formula for introducing speech is repeated, right? God said, then, and God said. Formula for introducing speech is repeated with no intervening response, meaning the other side never spoke here. This generally indicates some sort of significant A, silence, or B, a failure to comprehend, or C, a resistance to the speaker's words. In our case here, the flood-battered Noah needs further assurance. So God goes on to introduce the rainbow. So, right. So this is a great technique. And what this means, what does this actually mean? That we can imagine a world in which actually the rainbow was not a sign that God would never destroy the world again. Why would God? What would be that kind of? What would the Torah needed to have said at that point in order for God to not have brought the rainbow? That's a good question. Okay, so we see, by the way, right here, then, as we're kind of filling out different questions to ask while reading a Torah text, who's our listener? Of all possible events, why is this one chosen? Of all possible stories, a light word or word echoes. And then here's a repetition, but not exact, 100% exact repetition. And when a speaker addresses someone and the formula for introducing speech is repeated with no intervening response. So again, that's a technique to kind of look out for. Thanks, Robert Alter, for bringing that up. Okay, Yossi, as some of you who are in class remember, we talked about the seven mitzvot b'nei Noach, and here they are, and this is brought up in the Talmud. But of course, the Talmud asks a question, which we were all asking, actually Yossi was asking as well, which was mina hane mile, which is a technical term meaning from where are these words in the Torah? Show me the Torah source for these words, which is exactly what Yossi said. He said, okay, I get the idea that maybe in a covenant, in a brit, that there's two sides of the agreement, that God is agreeing to never destroy the world again, and Noach and his descendants are agreeing to these seven mitzvot. But where are they in the Torah itself? And here is what the here is how we get there. So I asked everyone in class to look at this, these words in the Torah, and I circled one part of it. But there's something else that you should see when you read this full piece, that there is a problem, and you can kind of use these words of every tree of the garden you are free to eat. So what is the problem? And the problem is that God said earlier, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon the earth. Every tree that is seed-bearing, they are for yours for food. So God does not need to repeat those words. So all of a sudden, then we can say, wait a second, this whole phrase right here, when it says, this whole phrase of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, that is a non-necessary part of a pasuk, part of a verse, meaning that those words must be there to teach us something. And of course, what are they going to be there for? They're going to be there to teach us the seven mitzvot b'nei Noach. Now, by the way, this is kind of important because, as you know, this part of this isn't coming up. The seven b'nei Noach laws, those seven laws, are not being introduced to Noah at the time of the flood. That they were kind of around, and in a sense, Noah is agreeing to those as part of the bargain. And so the question is why? So we're going to look exactly how each of these words, where you can kind of put on each of these words onto the basically, here are the 7 ideas: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And each of these relate to one of these words. And in class, we kind of checked out what examples of how this, which word this connects to, which word this connects to, which word this connects to, which word this connects to. So give me one guess of and try to justify the connection. It's actually hard to figure out, but actually I was surprised. In class, it was pretty intuitive. But we did get into a long discussion in class. Okay, so first of all, let's go through what we have. Look at that. So established courts comes from this word he commanded. No idol worships comes from the that word Elohim. No spilling blood is al ha'adam. No eating of a living thing is eat you will eat. No sexual crimes comes from the word saying. No cursing God should come from the word Hashem. So interestingly enough, right? So we have this idea that and no robbery is comes from. No robbery is from this Mikol Eitz Hagan, from all the fruit of the tree. Now, the logic is not always so clear, and what sometimes the rabbis do when they're connecting the mitzvah to these words, they're saying, well, I know something or somewhere else that uses that word that talks about this particular mitzvah, so I'm connecting the two of them. Or maybe there is a kind of a logic, right? So there was a logic actually for this one, no robbery and Mikol Eitz Hagan, because it says from all of the trees of the garden you can eat. And then, so basically, it's implying that there's some stuff that you can't eat where you would be trespassing. So that's kind of implying robbery in a sense. We got into a big discussion in class about are the rabbis just making this up? What comes first? Like we wouldn't normally actually understand if we saw this verse, that this verse would actually hint at these 7 mitzvot. And 7 things that Noach and his descendants need to do. So what I explained in class, and I'll explain it one more time here because I think it's an important one, maybe something we'll even see on our final, is that what is it that makes Midrash happen? What is it that makes the rabbis basically tell us that there's more to the Torah than meets the eye? And there are 2 components of that. One is a problem that is found in the text itself. And what's the problem of the text here? The problem of the text is that this whole pasuk, part of the pasuk, this whole part of the verse, never needed to be here. So why is it here? It must be here for another reason. Okay, so we're going to put that as one thing called a problem I see in the text. And then we have another thing called a problem that's just kind of floating around in the world. A problem that the writers of Midrash, in a sense, have about the world and about the world they've seen so far. And we discussed in class, what is the problem with the world that the writers of Midrash have seen so far? It's a world where, bad things have happened and people are punished for the bad things that they do, but how did they know that they were doing bad? And if they never knew they were doing bad, why should they in some way be punished? So that problem is going around in the rabbi's mind, and the only solution is, they must have been commanded about these general ideas of morality and of how to live in a moral society. Okay, that makes sense. And in that case, then I can say that Cain is guilty. Then I can say that the people of the flood should be destroyed because they've done something that is worthy of destroying the world. So the question is, if I have that problem, and I have a pasuk that I have a problem with being extra words, maybe I can link the two. Sometimes I can't link the two, but maybe I can. And so that's how Midrash forms. You need those 2 elements. One is a problem, and one is a problem in the text. Right? We saw that as well. Again, I mentioned this in class. We saw that again with Noach. The problem with Noach was what? And the problem we saw in the text was this weird phrase about the years 120. And they connected the two to say, for 120 years, Noah was kind of trying to tell everyone to repent and change their ways. So, because the problem was, why Noah? Why was he chosen and everyone else was destroyed? So again, Those two elements are really important when we kind of link up kind of ideas with certain phrases in the Torah. Okay. We then talked for a second about this graph right here, and we asked the question, how would this graph work? How would you kind of explain what the graph should be? The more God limits God, what happens to the responsibility of humanity? And then, so that's their question. And then the question is, can this ever go too far? What is God's ultimate desire? Is God's ultimate desire to be actually kicked out of the equation altogether? Is God's ultimate desire to be so limited that the responsibility of humanity rises to such an extent that you can actually get rid of God? And that brings in the story of the Tanor Shel Achnai. And this is a story that I told the class that we've studied, like Kelvin has been in my class every single year that possible, so for the last 3 years. And for the last 3 years, I've brought up this story each and every year. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'm going to ask the question because it's a great example of us, of a story that makes us answer the question, is there a limit to how small we can make God and how big we can make people as far as agency goes? And here's the story. There's an oven of Achnai, and there's a question over whether it can, if it is made impure, can it ever, by being broken and put back together, be rendered pure again? And we have two different ideas. So Rabbi Eliezer says, I want to call this a pure oven when it's put back together. And all of the other rabbis are saying, we want to call this an impure oven. Okay, and here's how this great story called the Tanor Shel Achnai. This is a story from the Talmud, not from the Torah, a story from the Talmud, but playing with the ideas, I think, that we see at the end of the book of Noah. So here's the story. Okay, lights, camera, action. We were going to act this out, but we never did. Okay, here we go. It was taught, so if you've never heard this story before, welcome to probably the greatest story of the Talmud. If you've heard it over time and time again, don't fall asleep. Okay, here we go. Narrator, it was taught on the day that Rabbi Eliezer brought out every possible on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought out every possible argument trying to show that he was correct, but the other rabbis did not accept the argument. Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law is the way I say it is, if the halakha is the way I say it is, this carob tree will move from over here to over there. And sure enough, the carob tree got up and moved from place to place. That's a miracle. Oh my goodness. And some people say it even moved further than that. Okay, let's move on in our story. Okay, there it is, carob tree moving. I don't think that's a carob tree, but. And the rabbi said, just because a carob tree magically moves 100 cubits from its place, this does not prove that you're correct, Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer came back and said to the rabbis, if the law is like I say it is, if the halakha is the way I say it is, then let this stream of water will prove it by reversing its flow and flow instead of downstream, but upstream. And lo and behold, the stream of water reverses and began flowing upstream. Let's see. Look at that. It totally does. Okay. And the rabbi said, just because a stream that normally flows downstream is now flowing upstream, this does not prove that you are correct. Now, Eliezer is getting frustrated, and he said, if the law is like I say it is, if the halakha is the way I say it is, and halakha means Jewish law, then let the walls of this study hall, this Beit HaMidrash, prove it. And look at that. The walls start closing in, and the walls would have crushed the rabbis had not Rabbi Joshua yelled at them and said, he yells at the walls, if students of Torah are engaged in halachic dispute, if students of Torah are engaged in an argument over Jewish law, what right do you have to interfere? So out of respect to Rabbi Joshua, the walls stopped from crushing the rabbis, but out of respect to Rabbi Eliezer, the walls did not move back to their original place. And if you go to the study hall where the argument took place today, you can see that the walls remain this way today. Narrator 1. The Rabbi Eliezer turned to the rabbi and said, if the halakha agrees with me, if the law agrees with me, let the voice of God, a bat call, that's the voice of God, cry out and declare that I'm correct. And sure enough, the voice of God cries out from heaven saying, why are you all arguing? Don't you realize that in all matters of Jewish law, Rabbi Eliezer is always correct? Right? Then Rabbi Joshua stood up and cried out, Lo bashamayim he. It is not in heaven. And kudos to Ethan, who brought this actually up in class before we even did it. He brought it up today. Can you believe it? He brought it up today, and this is what I was going to do in class today. So I said, Ethan, stop talking because I need to, this is part of the lesson today. Thank you, Ethan. Amazing. Okay, so again, why are you all arguing? Don't you realize that in all matters of Jewish law, Rabbi Elazar is correct. Rabbi Joshua says, "Lo bashamayim he," and of course the rabbis say, "What did he mean by that? What did he mean by that?" So I ask you what he means by that first. Okay, welcome back. Rabbi Jeremiah gives an explanation. I'll tell you what Rabbi Joshua means. He means that the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. Therefore, we no longer pay any attention to a bat kol, a heavenly voice, because God wrote in the Torah, in cases of law, we follow the majority. Look at that. And sure enough, there it is. It's true. In Shemot, chapter 23, verse 5, Acharei Rabim lahatod. After the majority, you should lean. And so the rabbi is saying, we learn from there that if there's one person arguing against many, we follow the many, even if God's voice should be there. Now, check this out. A bit later, Rabbi Natan came across Rabbi Elijah, the prophet, who never died and spent time hanging out with God in heaven, and asked him, "Hey Elijah, since you live up in heaven, maybe you can answer a question for me." Here it is. At the very moment that Rabbi Joshua said the words, "It is not in heaven," how did God react? Right? Did he cry? Was he jealous? Was he right? And Elijah says, right after Rabbi Joshua told God that man should not listen to him anymore, God laughed. He said, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me." And the words, by the way, in Hebrew are nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. So right. And so if someone explains to me why is God laughing? Why is God saying, "My children have defeated me," when that seems like a bad thing, but he's actually laughing about this? What's that all about, right? Okay. And so obviously my question is, why am I bringing this up? Why is this part of the story? This shows, if we're talking about that graph of the more God limits myself, the more agency people have, is there a limit? And that's the question right here. Is there a limit to how, to the agency that we should have, even if it means that God tells us something's true and we say, "Nope, sorry about that. That is actually not true." By the way, if this idea interests you at all, there is a chapter in the book, The Brothers Karamazov, that is almost a standalone piece called The Grand Inquisitor, that talks about this, not from a Jewish perspective, but almost talks about this exact same story, but from a Christian perspective, where actually Jesus comes back to life and is walking around, and actually the heads of the church place Jesus under arrest. And it's amazing. It's amazing. Okay. Okay. So now we're moving on, and we are going to now, but not really moving on, because we're now going to be looking at one more final piece of the Noah story. And this really comes from Judy Klitzner, who we've seen before with the Cain and Abel story, but she wrote a book called Subversive Sequels in the Bible. And if you don't believe me, just ask Emily Rockwell, who's in our class, because she read this book and she is an expert. But so Judy says the following. She says, "The Bible is in constant replay of its stories. It invites comparison and interpretation of certain passages in light of others. The subtle echoes from one story to the next guide us towards a broader comparison of the two narratives. The subversive sequel reveals the development not only of the human heroes, but also of God as well." Okay? So that is really what we're going to do right now, is we are going to look, because Judy says that when we look at the story of Noah, we actually need to look at another story, its subversive sequel, meaning there is another story much later, and it's not even in the Torah, but it's in the Tanakh, in the Bible, and it is called the Book of Yonah. And we need to look at that book because actually that book is in some way talking to the story of Noah and actually making specific claims that are almost trying to reverse some of the claims that are made in the story of Noah. It's an amazing, amazing idea, and we're going to try to go through that at this point. So, of course, the first thing we need to do when we discover a subversive sequel, we need to ask ourselves, is it a sequel? And how do we know it's a sequel? And Judy Klitzner says we can see it's a sequel by seeing commonalities between the two stories. Maybe common words, maybe word echoes, maybe themes, maybe common characters or ideas. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But of course, that means we need to look at the book of Yonah first. So here it is, my friends, the book of Yonah. What I'll ask you to do is read it through and answer the questions that are being provided. Okay, I'll just keep this up here, so you might want to pause this, and here are the questions that I'm going to be asking you. Okay? Great, go and answer those questions. Next part of the story. And here are the questions that you're going to answer. Okay, you can look back here if you need to. And here's the next part of the story. I'll move my head. Here are the questions that we're going to answer. Okay, next part of the story. Oh boy, sorry. And here's that final question. Great. Now, after reading that story, you should be able to, there are seven commonalities that Judy Klitzner focuses on and says that's what makes this a subversive sequel. That's what makes Yonah kind of echoing the story of the book of Noah. And so here's some hints. If you so hint number one is there's a common name in both of the stories. There's a common thing that floats in both of the stories. There is a thing that happens when that floating item is floating on the sea that's common. Both two different places are being destroyed because of some kind of common thing. What is that common thing? There is a common number between the two stories. What is that? This is a little bit harder. How much does our main character speak? And let me just go back for a second to the Noah story so you can actually see how much how much does Yonah say when he is in the city? And if you remember, how much does Yonah speak? Does Noah speak? Okay. And what is the role of sleep in both the stories? And to actually get this answer, you may have to go back to the part of the story of Noah building a vineyard. If you don't see it here, you can look at that. You can go to Sefaria chapter, Bereshit chapter, or Genesis chapter 9. Okay, great. Okay, and so here are the answers to those questions. Yonah Yonah the prophet, Yonah the dove, the ark and the boat Yonah falls asleep on, raging destructive storm, people being destroyed because of the lack of ethics and morals. Both main characters say very little. Noah says nothing, and Yonah says only 3 words to the people of Nineveh, or 4 words, or something like that. In this, or a couple words. 40 days of flood versus 40 days until Nineveh will be destroyed. Both men ended up falling asleep. Noah's a drunk, and Yonah sleeping while waiting to see what happens to the city. So, Judy Klitzner believes that there is enough of a commonality to call the book of Yonah a subversive sequel, kind of a rewriting of the story, helping us to answer questions that we might have or ideas we might have about God, but doing them in different ways. And before I go to specific questions, why don't you just give me your idea of how you might view the story of Yonah, rewriting the story of Noah and rewriting how God works in the story, how God works in the world. right? So God works one way in the book of Noah, and how Yonah kind of changes our perception. The book of Yonah changes our perception of how God works. Great. So now let's kind of go through some pointed questions. So is God a strict justice enforcer, or is God a forgiver? In the book of Noah, what is the story? What is the answer to that? In the book of Yonah, what is the answer? And what does, next question is, what does Noah's silence seem to tell us about his agreement or disagreement of of God's job in some way? And what does Yonah's action seem to tell us about Yonah's agreement or disagreement about how God works? Really interesting. Okay, next. Can wayward people change their ways? How does the book of Noah answer that question? How does the work of Yonah answer that question? And third is, who do we expect to be rough and rude and crude and instead turns out to be kind and compassionate? Who are those people, right? Next, how ironclad are God's decrees? Is God an unchangeable God? Here's what I say. Here's how it will always be. Book of Noah, book of Yonah. And what is the quintessential, the highest role of the biblical hero? How does Noah say what is the great role of the biblical hero? And Yonah asks what is the great role? What is the great role that Yonah shows is the role of the biblical hero? Good. And here's something that Judy says. The story of Yonah is a story about a God who refuses to let a prophet ignore his responsibility to the world. And here's a question, my final question. Is the God of the book of Yonah how God is because of the God of the story of the flood, right? Is it that God changes because of the flood story, and then we see that God manifests God's self in a very similar story, but does it differently because of what God has learned in the Noah story? Or is it something that God needs more time to really figure out? Okay, and a last comment by Judy Klitzner is, while God's compassion has increased, as shown in the book of Yonah, people's, like Yonah's compassion and understanding, has decreased. So I know we saw this graph when we asked, as God limits God's self, the responsibility of people has increased. But there is a danger there, because giving God the opportunity to show compassion or lack of compassion is one thing, but because God is God and God can always bring that kind of sense of compassion to the play. But what happens when people who are completely in charge lack that compassion? Then there are real repercussions. And just one last comment. Since the flood, God has stretched his heart and made room for humanity to change its heart as well. Yonah clings to absolutes, looking for consistency and truth instead of nuance and flexibility. Perhaps God hints at this by offering the rainbow, signaling that from now on his will, like the rainbow, is pliant or flexible. Oh, sorry. Look, I'm making a hand motion here. Pliant or flexible, and that colors can shade into one another with room for nuance. So that's kind of our final question of the day, is how is actually the rainbow actually a symbol of the God God has learned to be, and the God that will be made manifest in God's fullest colors in the story of Yonah. All right, everyone. When we're in class on Monday, we will start with Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel. Look forward to seeing you there.